Hey there, it's Tony here, and welcome to episode 43 of the Dumb Leaders podcast. Today, losing the unloseable. That's right, that's what we're talking about, losing the unloseable. See, on Saturday here in Australia, Aussies did the unthinkable. They really did. We voted to return a conservative government and ultimately reject the Labor Party who had a reform agenda. For those outside of Australia, the conservative side or the right side of politics is dominated by the Liberal National Party, the LNP, and we have minor parties on the right like One Nation and the Australia United Party. Now, the Australian United Party, Clive Palmer, who is the businessman head, I guess, of the Australian United Party, spent more than double in political advertising than the other two major parties combined, yet ultimately didn't win a seat. So there's a little bit of rhetoric around that in respect of, hey, it doesn't really matter how much you spend if the policies don't add up. People are going to see that. But as you'll see also during the course of this podcast, there are some people that claim that that had some benefit to the right side of politics. But on the left side in Australia, we see the Australian Labor Party, and much further to the left is the Green Party, the Green Party. So Labor has the background of the union movement, while the Greens are focused on being the dominant voice for the environment. And with this on the left side and also on the right side, there's this conglomeration group of activist groups, and some of them seem particularly oblivious to what many would call fair play. So, but why was it surprising, Tony? Well, it was surprising for a variety of reasons. Every opinion poll had the Labor Party winning, every opinion poll. And in addition to that, the exit polling on the day of our vote indicated that Labor would pick up 52% of the vote to the LNP's 48% two-party preferred. We have compulsory preferential voting here in Australia. So 52% of the vote was as part of the exit polling when people leave the polls. 52% of the vote was attributed to going to the Labor side, and the LNP were picking up 48%. So even the exit polling results were indicating that the Labor Party were going to win this election. But then a funny thing happened. The vote started being counted. And what we started to see was that this swing, which would be visible very early on, just wasn't there. In fact, in many seats, the swing was against Labor, which was defying the logics of what the polls and the exit polls were saying. They lost the unloseable election. And for many people, their world has just simply exploded. But I'll talk about that in a sec. So what went wrong? So let's look at what went wrong here. Firstly, one of the polls that continued to indicate the only strength that the LNP or the right side of politics had was the preferred Prime Minister polls. And they continually, over the course of many, many years, continually showed that Bill Shorten, the Labor leader, was less preferred than what Scott Morrison for the LNP or the reigning Prime Minister was. And in fact, and not by a little, it was quite a bit. Usually Bill would poll around 32%, while Morrison would poll about 41%. So that's a sizable difference. And that pretty much stayed the same for the last preferred PM poll. And the interesting thing here is that when you looked at that preferred PM poll just a little bit closer, Morrison rated an 80% approval rating amongst the LNP voters, people who identified themselves as LNP voters, while Shorten could only muster 69% against those who identified themselves as Labor voters. So even amongst his diehard voters, Bill couldn't get an approval rating. He is 69% amongst your tribe amongst your heartland was probably pretty ordinary. So even the heartland particularly didn't fancy Bill Shorten as the Prime Minister. Now, a few days before the election, I shared my belief that my local member would romp home, and he did. That's in the Bowman electorate here in southeast Queensland. Well, on the day of the election, and what I also said to my business acquaintance was that on the day of the election, I believe that people would wake up on election day, and that is when the call and the judgment was going to be made on Bill Shorten. And I firmly believe that this was the case. People just woke up and said, do I really want Bill as my Prime Minister? So that's my belief, and I guess that in some respects that was shown by the result. But what was also relevant is that the 2 days before the election and the day after I'd spoken to my business acquaintance, unfortunately we lost the great Bob Hawke, one of the great doyens of Australian politics, one of the great prime ministers of all time, now passed away. Now, Bob at his peak had a 75% approval rating amongst all Aussies. Okay, so take that in. So we're talking Shorten with 32% and Morrison with 41%, but here we had Bob Hawke, when he was Prime Minister of Australia, had an approval rating of about 75%. That's pretty awesome. And so he appealed and he connected with Australia, not just the Labor side of politics, also very clearly the right side of politics. He was a great servant. And part of me started to think that this was going to have a final say in the Australian political scene. So many people were saying, you know, do it for Bob and do it for Hawkey and whatnot. And it was at this stage that most people really started to suspect that Labor was going to be a shoo-in, and in some respects this was Bob's last impact. And the tributes flowed, and we had so many people pay tribute. Some were criticised for their tributes, but, you know, that's increasingly the world that we live in, I guess. But what was really relevant for me is that the two leaders, so Scott Morrison spoke about Bob Hawke, spoke really eloquently off the cuff and from the heart, and Bill read from a prepared speech and notes, and it was awkward. It was awkward. It wasn't authentic. And I think that people picked up on that. I mean, what he said was great, you know, but it was awkward and it wasn't from the heart, and it had to come from prepared notes. And again, the comparison remains, you know, the comparison between the two leaders. But now, importantly, there was a comparison between Bill Shorten and Bob Hawke. And so bear in mind, this was the leader, the great Australian leader, with 75% approval from all Aussies. And then we've got the current leader of the Labor Party with just 69% from his own heartland. So we saw this. Potentially what the Australian public saw was this great contrast. And once again asked the question, can we see Bill Shorten as the Prime Minister of Australia? And, you know, that was one of the aspects of the election in my mind, one of the key aspects. People just couldn't see Bill Shorten as the Prime Minister of Australia. But it was only just part of the puzzle, and let me just give you a little bit of a background. Now, in all honesty, Australia has some real issues at the moment. You know, business confidence is low, wages growth is mediocre. We've had historically low interest rates for years, but we have a housing affordability crisis. There's mixed messages on climate change. We have a serious issue with the rising cost of living and energy prices. We've got a really flat wage line. We've made some progress on gender equality, and, you know, when they started talking about gender equality back in the 40s, I guess, if you were to map the progress from then would have been quite startling to what it is today. But, you know, there's still a way to go, and there's obviously some progress being made with our native land right holders. and Indigenous Australians, and the recognition of some, but clearly there's still a way to go. And especially when you listen to those that advocate on those particular issues, Australia has come a long way, but obviously we still have a way to go. So you would have thought that the Labor opposition would have romped home with a clear message. And if they'd confined themselves to a clear message of stifling the rising cost of living, greater employment, and let's get some impact on the wage growth, if they'd done that, they would have romped home, in my eyes, because very simple message to sell, because everyone knows wages are flat. Everyone knows the rising cost of living. And we still have a way to get people into... we live in a disruptive world. Employment's never going to be the same again. We acknowledge that, absolutely. But, to fuel and to fund people into this new disruptive world, into the new industry and technologies that are disrupting current industry. But instead, what they did, they created this complex wave of policy. So when the nation's hurting, really a simple message was needed. But what they did was created a complex wave of policy reform that would have hurt many sectors of the economy. Housing investors, retiring people, anyone that earned over 150k a year, they faced the brunt and the cost of these policy reforms. And, and that's not even going into the fact that they couldn't put a costing around their climate change policies. They went in with a big agenda around climate change, but they couldn't cost them. The critics of the Labor policies would have promoted the fact that it was class warfare from the left, and the supporters talked about time for a change, need for a change. And the reality is it wasn't bought by the majority of Australians. That's the reality. It wasn't bought by the majority of the people of Australia. And that's hurt. And that's really hurt some of the people on the left. And you can see that hurt in some of the Twitter messages that have just been completely overboard and on top, but over the top. But obviously there's a lot of pain. There was an expectation that they would win, and when that win didn't come, we've seen the Twitter warriors come out and just cane people, and I'll go through that in a sec. Because what I saw once again, and Sam Harris, I listened to Sam Harris. To me, I think he's quite orderly in his conversation discussion. I don't always agree with what he talks about, of course, as you would be hard-pressed for people to agree 100% with anyone else. But I like the fact that he talks about it. He brings it to discussion, and he brings opposing views onto his podcast so that discussion can be had and can be heard. So Sam Harris shared a conversation with Rebecca Traister on his podcast around the Me Too movement. And in an incident, in the conversation, they brought up an incident. Well, Sam brought up an incident where Matt Damon came up for discussion, where Matt Damon waded into the Me Too discussion with a tweet where he talked about the need for some objectivity around accusations and some other stuff, in which Matt was incredibly roundly criticised by hundreds of ferocious tweets, and he was pretty much verbaled and Twitter bashed around what many would have considered a moderate tweet, just sort of expressing some views around we just need to be mindful and we need to make sure it's horrible if the allegations are there, etc., but we've got to make sure that they're true. Bashed for it. So absolutely bashed. He was what I would call, many would consider it a moderate tweet. But none of that was seen by the verbal bashists. And as Sam revealed, Matt Damon apologised and excused himself from the conversation. And I remember thinking about that at the time that Sam said he excused himself from the conversation, because I remembered thinking and questioning, he excused himself from the conversation, but it still probably didn't change his mind. all we ultimately saw was one less voice in the conversation. And the bashing wouldn't have changed his mind. He would have still held those views. Now, publicly, yes, he would have apologised. But our views, as you know, most of them are held privately. So, and what seems to have happened, and with that as a bit of a story and a lead-in, what seems to have happened in some of the topics that need to be discussed. We need to have these discussions in Australia. You know, climate change, our Indigenous original inhabitants are just two areas. But people have excused themselves from the conversation because of, you know, people calling them rednecks, people calling them racist, people calling them bigots. We resort to this sort of name calling. And when it does, people just excuse themselves from the conversation. Their views haven't changed. They're just not talking about it because, you know, people aren't going to put themselves up for ridicule or criticism. So all the lecturing, all the judgments, all the name calling, it just doesn't influence the majority of people. As is evidence, the mindset doesn't change. They are not talking. And if they did, would the vocal minority listen? I'm not sure. You know, here's some examples. It was billed as a climate change election, and one advert from a left activist group showed survivors of the 2019 Tasmanian bushfires. Now, these were a horrendous event. Any bushfire is a horrendous event. Now, the ad depicted survivors of the bushfires reciting phrases from the conservative politicians who had questioning views on or a questioning take on climate change. Now, the message was clear. They were linking the Tassie bushfires with climate change. Absolutely crystal clear. But people didn't buy it. Now, the message, the bushfires have been acknowledged as being started from lightning strikes, multiple lightning strikes, in fact. And during the course of the bushfires, over 3% of the land in Tassie was burned. So that's, you know, fairly substantial. Now, climate change is being seen as the cause for every national disaster known today, whether it's a cyclone, a hurricane, a flooding event, or fire. But some people just still... We've had bushfires from lightning strikes since the dawn of time. We've had cyclones since the dawn of time. We've had hurricanes and floods since the dawn of time. But now we're just blaming climate change. Now, there's probably a link, I'm not sure, but I think that when you throw it down people's throats like that, and people are saying, well, we had Tasmanian bushfires in 1967, were they caused by climate change? Don't know. But, you know, the reality is that almost everyone would acknowledge that humans have had some impact on this world. You would be... most people would know that, you know, from our pristine world when there was nothing here, just beautiful, pristine countryside, and even going back 200, 300 years. And now what do we have? We've got a world that's ruled by bitumen, concrete, steel, emissions. Of course, most people would say, yeah, of course we've had to have had an impact on our world. Obviously, our world at its most pristine surely has been impacted. But providing a link between a natural disaster and considering there have been bushfires in Tassie in 1858, 1967, 2013. Now, there was another one in 2016, and that started from an out-of-control campfire, from what I can read and research. I'm happy to be proved wrong if I'm not. So obviously, you know, 2013, 2016, 2019, maybe there is a little bit of a link there. But potentially, you know, there may be a link between increased storm activity. Some may see that. Many don't. I guess that's the reality. And when it's put into an advert like that, that's designed to be guilt, you know, people just don't take it on. The majority of the people weren't influenced. That message didn't work. It was also billed as an election on the economy. Now, the economy isn't in great shape, you know. And the Labor policy of raising funds through the removal of things like negative gearing and further tax on super was seen as a way to raise funds to pay for things like their increased wages and promises. Now, bearing in mind, one thing, very brave, they put their costings out a full week before the election, but they still didn't cost their climate change policies. So, and what I found interesting around the costings of the Labor campaign was that they, early on in the campaign, they focused on funding their promises by getting foreign nationals to pay their fair share of tax. That's awesome. That's great. And it was a clear message. We want to crack down on foreign multinational tax evasion. Awesome. When they released their costings, when they released their budget costings, it became very clear that this was only a minor part of how they were planning to raise their revenue. The majority was coming from the people of Australia. So negative gearing, franking credits, high income earners, super concessions, changes to family trusts, all bore the brunt. So just to give you an idea, the numbers, there was $58 billion that were going to be raised in the removal of franking credits, $32 billion raised with the what they were doing with negative gearing. There was $30 billion in super. There was $27 billion in family trust, $6.3 billion in high income tax, whatever that tax correction, I think they put it down as tax correction, and a paltry, and I say a paltry, $6.9 billion in multinational tax avoidance, $58 billion in franking, $32 billion in negative gearing, $30 billion in super, $27 billion in family trust, $6.3 billion in tax correction in high income, and $6.9 billion for multinationals. Almost deceitful that they were claiming that they were paying for their promises through cracking down on multinationals, when ultimately the money was going to be coming from the people of Australia. People saw that. Full credit to Labor for releasing their policy over a week before, but people saw that. And they would have been seen by so many in the people that as being deceitful. And the payments were coming from the people of Australia, people that were aspiring and people who were aspiring and wanting to earn and work more, and then obviously the people who'd already worked much of their lives and were looking forward to a retirement or leaving something for their kids. And all of a sudden people felt that was a threat. Now, all of these impacts would have also had an impact on the economy, because at the moment that money is already in the economy in some way, shape or form. It's either propping up in savings or shares, or it's being circulated. So that money was no longer going to be in the economy. So we would have had an impact on the economy by all of those additional charges. And whether we like it or not, everybody's super is backed by some level of corporate success, because all super portfolios, most super, well, I'm not going to say all because there are self-managed super funds, but most super funds are backed by company shares. So we all play a part and all benefit from having a strong corporate economy. And that would have been lost in some respects. Now my thoughts on the election. The election was decided on, a number of things. But to me, the key was the lack of popularity of Bill, the lack of influence on climate change policy and the cost of the policies on the economy, and the perception of the overwhelming impact on the cost of Labor policies. They were the three key things from and my opinion. I'm happy to be slaughtered. I'm happy to be called out. I'm happy to have those haters out there hate on me. But ultimately, that's what I saw. Now, what helped is that the right side of politics finally gained a little bit of discipline and aligned more closely together. So even though there's some clear and utter ratbags on the right side of politics, as there are very clearly on the left side of politics. The right side ultimately said, well, we're more aligned to the right, so we're going to distribute our preferences to the right. Now, let me be clear about preferences here. Preferences are an individual choice. We choose where our preferences go. And just because a party says we're going to distribute our preferences this way, we don't have to do that as individual voters. I certainly didn't do that. But ultimately, there was some discipline there on the right side of politics. Now, as I said, there are some lunatics on the on the right side of politics, and the left have always derided the Liberal National Party when they've aligned to the parties like One Nation and Australia and Clive Palmer's party. They've derided them, and I think that the Liberal National Party have never done that before because of the fact that there was this criticism. Yet no one criticises the Labor Party for linking with the left, the further left Greens. And that, in all likelihood, had more impact on this particular election than that. So for some, really cool that the right side became... They realised that they were more closely aligned than the left. There's not much point LNP giving their second preference to the Labor Party, because that would more or less just give the election to the Labor Party. But ultimately, by giving preferences from a party sense to places like One Nation and vice versa, it created a little bit of discipline and created some power back to the right side of politics. And that was especially true in some of the tight seats. Now, it's certainly been interesting since the election loss. Really interesting. And you can clearly see the pain. So Bill Shorten resigned as a leader of the Labor Party and on the night. And I'm going to talk next week, I think, about Bill Shorten's concession speech to the party faithful, because... there was a couple of different losing speeches there on the night, and I just want to have a look at them, and I want to decipher them, and I want to dissect them a little bit, because, there's some messages of, there were some that were really humble and humility, and really full of humility, and then there was others that seemed to say the right things, but maybe didn't. So we'll dissect that. But Bill resigned as leader of the Labor Party. Personally, I believe that Tanya Plibersek should have been then putting her hand up, but we've heard today she's dropped out of the Labor race, so who knows where that goes. Tanya would have been a very worthy and a strong leader of the Labor Party, and obviously now that's not going to happen. Now Twitter's gone crazy. Twitter has gone crazy, and I guess it went crazy when Trump, and they're comparing Trump to ScoMo and Brexit, and, everyone's saying how mad it is. They've called Queensland rednecks and hillbillies. Labor lost ground in Queensland. Let's be serious now. We have a very, I would suggest, unpopular Labor state parliament here in Queensland, and Labor lost ground in Queensland. We've got some mining proposals that are just being played with and toyed with by government. Regional Queensland's hurting. There's a variety of reasons. We've got people on Twitter calling out others for being selfish. So Queenslanders are rednecks and hillbillies. Everyone who voted Liberal National are selfish or rich, or there's so many tweets about people leaving Australia, especially going to New Zealand. And along with those tweets, you then get the associated tweets from people who are posting up copies of links back to the airlines and things like goodbye and see ya. Now, just as the Americans said we're moving to Canada, I'm pretty certain we're not going to see a mass exodus to New Zealand. And it's all just in emotion. But I think really, there needs to be a little bit more, I won't say control, but... obviously people are really upset. And, when people keep saying you're going to win, you're going to win, you're going to win, and you lose, of course, that comes as a bit of a shock. You know, we've seen the ridiculous in respect of some of the Twitter arguments too. People saying that we voted to kill off the Great Barrier Reef, that we voted to kill off our Indigenous people. Rah, rah, rah. And that's just crap. And I'll talk about that in a sec. We've got social media people saying how sad it is for the youth of Australia to see this. There's people blaming the Murdoch press and people blaming Clive Palmer. Now, firstly, let's just have a look at some of this. Firstly, if Bill wasn't leader and they ran a simplified platform, they would have won. They just would not have lost. So, you know, when the country's not in great shape, and you know, I'm sitting here admitting we're not in great shape. Have a simplified platform. Don't make it too hard, and don't make it complex. Have a really simple platform, you know. And Labor's lost a big proportion of their heartland, the blue-collar worker, who voted against it. And interestingly, the high-income greenies now that are out there, that have earned their money through whatever means, and now believe that it's their role, and some of these are in heartland Liberal seats, voted for Labor. So they've shifted. So these higher income people that have worked all their lives, that, you know, run businesses, successful business, now feel it's their role to give back, and that's awesome. That's fantastic. So Liberal lost some of that space because of what we could call some confusion or ambiguity around their climate change policies. But Labor lost their heartland, the blue-collar worker, in a lot of seats. And, you know, but also what Labor failed to meet, many people, I would suppose, who support Labor or have supported Labor previously in their life are small business owners, you know, whether they're tradies, whether they're sole practitioners, whether they're professionals. A lot of those people, there was nothing in the policy announcements for small business. There was nothing in the agenda that suggested a vote for Labor was a good vote for small business. Now, so now they get a chance to rewrite the ship, I guess. So, you know, they've got 3 years in opposition, so hopefully they'll be able to rewrite the ship. So, Queensland are not hillbillies. I'm from Queensland. I am not a hillbilly. And many of them are concerned for the future, as anyone else is. So turning on Queensland really doesn't sit well for the Labor state government here. They've got an election in 2020, and it certainly won't change people's minds. So many people are regional, and we've seen a huge transition away from regional Australia in terms of jobs. And many people are moving to the city. Many people in Queensland are involved in tourism. They voted where they saw the best fit. They voted where they saw the best fit, not the perfect fit, but they voted where they saw the best fit. So, and they may have thought it was the better fit, of course. Now, one of the big things that I say is that insults don't influence. So when people are being called rednecks, or other assorted names, that doesn't change their mind. In fact, that probably makes them more steadfast to stick with whatever their decision-making process was. Now, we have to learn and listen to people, and we've got to teach people how to influence, how to have discussions and listen to people that have contrasting views. Because it's only when we can listen to people can we really, truly understand why they have those views and how best we can influence them to change their views. So with respect to being selfish, we fail to understand that most people are fundamentally motivated by self-interest, period, bottom line. It's in our DNA. Now, even those giving to the community are motivated by how they feel with that. So they've got self-interest, they've got self-preservation. It's not selfish. It's just in our DNA. The election wasn't decided by franking credits, no matter how many people try and tell you that it was. It was clear that people who are working hard or have worked hard to have something in retirement were not going to allow their hard work to be reduced by percentages. Now, I hope all governments learn from this. We should never tax incentive or aspiration. In fact, we need more of it. We need to create that incentive for everyone to get out there and have a crack. Now, in respect to the straw man arguments, things like you've just voted to kill the reef and all the assorted rhetoric around that, throwing that at people just doesn't help anyone, and it doesn't make sense. If the intended result of the government is to kill the Great Barrier Reef, and that's a big part of the economy, can I tell you, in tourism, and it's an absolutely ridiculous argument, and it's worthy of the contempt that it deserves, as does a lot of the straw man arguments that they bring in. If you want to argue a point, make it on the best argument that someone has. Sam Harris calls that the steel man argument, not the straw man. And just throwing that we're killing the Great Barrier Reef, we voted to kill the reef, is just ridiculous. And it's not even worth really talking about. I find blaming Murdoch ridiculous. The same papers that shared the polls, commissioned the polls stating that Labor was going to romp home, somehow managed to brainwash everyone to vote against them. Now, with the decline of papers and even TV to a large extent, the reality of the message is the message didn't gel. So the reality is the message from Labor just didn't gel. You know, and I found this interesting. Tanya Pilbasek was asked what went wrong on election night. She stated they needed more time to educate the public. Once again, condescending and wrong message once again. You know, they've had a term of government to educate the public. You know, they've had that term in opposition. But what you see when they're in opposition, what you see when anyone's in opposition, is they have a focus on the policies and blocking and obstructionist sort of processes. So the focus is always on the government's policies. But that's an unreal time for the opposition to be giving a clear alternative. So once again, I just don't get that. Educate the public. You know, Clive Palmer being blamed, well, no one voted for him, so he got no seats. He annoyed the hell out of everyone with his $60 million of political ads. I don't necessarily know it was a smear campaign against the left side, because he sort of slated Scott Morrison just as much as what he did, you know, the Labor side. So, you know, I just find that one, confusing to say the least. Now, in respect of all these people that are decrying for the youth of Australia, you know, the reality is, based on the numbers, that a lot of the youth of Australia actually voted on the right side of politics. So many youth have decided on careers, they're working hard to achieve goals, many have their own businesses, they're involved in startups and technology. And to win so commandingly, many of these poor affected youth, they voted for the conservative side of politics. Now, youth is youth. You know, whether they're in a job, whether they've got a startup, whether they're business orientated, whether they're at university, whether they're an activist, you know, youth are youth. Just as there's lefties as people grow older and greenies as people grow older, there's lefties and greenies in the youth, and there's conservative people in the right. So don't feel sorry for them, because they helped shape the election. They helped shape the election. You know, many of those poor affected youth voted for it. So, and once again, they made the choice that there was nothing in that Labor agenda that provided them the hope that they looked for. So finally, just coming to a close on this podcast, you don't win an election simply because you believe it's time. You must be a strong alternative that looks after the whole population. The politics that call the top end of town, you know, high income earners, big business, class warfare, whatever, it's just been shown not to work. You know, it's not my role to educate anyone in this. Everyone's got their own opinions. Everyone's entitled to their own opinions. I just wanted to share my thoughts. Just some advice firstly for the government, right? So starting immediately, work on your own policies, but then start working on some of those three key areas that I talked about: the cost of living, wage growth for all, and wait for it. I think you need to get a bit clearer around climate change. So become a leader in this space, and, you know, the conservative side of politics will often talk about the big emitters, China and US, and there's no denying that. And we are only a low emitter in relation to emissions, but as has been pointed out, there's a lot of countries that are low emitters. But if we can bring all those countries together and lead that group effectively, and all those low emission countries take a stand and make a difference, we can actually make a really big difference. So I think, the government does need to work on climate change. It does need to have a strong policy. It does need to start setting some targets. Now, I would personally like to see a big-ticket infrastructure program to help drought-proof our country. We've seen situations where there are floods and monsoonal rains in North Queensland, and surely with the brains that we have in this country, we can create something that starts to drought-proof certain parts of our wonderful nation. Now, back in 1938, an engineer developed what we know as the Bradfield scheme. Now, it was criticised right through its life as for the cost to build it and maintain it. Yet, every time it floods, it seems to come back into discussion and then just seems to disappear again. Now, this year we had horrendous floods in Townsville. And surely with the right will, we could find a way. Now, I reckon if the infrastructure can be built where there's a will, and I just wonder if we were another country. I wonder if we were another country and really invested in creating some infrastructure to benefit the whole nation, what we could do. So surely we can find, if we've got the will, we can find a way. Also for the government, I just would love to see some further progress on the state of our Indigenous people. We've come a long way from our historical past. Some of the pain that was caused by the European settlement, some of the pain caused by what I'm going to say is good intention, but not knowing any better. We all know better now, and we need to progress on this. I'm not really sure what this looks like, but we need to find a path to ease the pain. And if it starts with changing something like our national anthem, so be it. Personally, I think a mix of My Island Home, originally by the Warumpi Band and more famously covered by Christine Anu, and Peter Allen's I Still Call Australia Home would be perfect. So My Island Home with I Still Call Australia Home, and you could really create an amazing anthem out of that I'm pretty sure we'd all be proud of and pumped about. Advice to the opposition, don't block stuff simply because you're the opposition, especially in those three main areas, cost of living, climate and wage growth. Present your case and work hard to improve the legislation, but not block it. Put forward your case that, if you would give a greater tax cut to a portion of the population, put forward your case, make that a public announcement, but say in the interests of the Australian people, we are going to support this legislation, even though we believe it could be better. And we've argued that case in Parliament, and the numbers didn't fall our way. We know the numbers are important in Parliament, but let your position be known, but let's not block things for the sake of being blocked. Work for all Australians, for better government, and effective opposition does this. A poor one blocks progress. So to the people on the outer edge of the right or left, learn to listen, learn to ask questions. You get so much more understanding when you ask questions and listen. No one likes name-calling or insults. We cannot influence with insults. We can't learn through name-calling. It's clear Australia has reacted to the judgmental, the lecturing approach that some in the community have. We're tired of activists, whether it's vegan activists disrupting legitimate and lawful farming, or whether it's Bill Brown's Stop Adani blockade. I think we're tired. People are tired. So learn to listen. Find common ground. The reality is ask some questions. Ask a question like, do you believe that humans have had an impact on the pristine nature of our world? Loaded question, absolutely. But I'd be hard-pressed to find anyone that would say, no, of course we've had an impact. We've mined it, we've ripped down trees, we've done all of these things. We pump stuff into the atmosphere, So learn to find that common ground. Talk of inclusion is simply talk. Inclusion includes including the views that you oppose in the conversation. So just because someone has an opposing view doesn't mean we should shout them out or drown them out. Bullying people out of the conversation doesn't change the view of the person. It simply stops it being heard until they can be heard. And that's what we saw on Saturday. People who weren't in the conversation were heard on Saturday. And you didn't like it because you'd bullied them out of the conversation. So is Australia divided? In the eyes of some, they would say yes. But in reality, we've always had a degree of division and long party lines. Some seem to see that at this moment in time, it's unrepairable. And maybe they're looking at the problem the wrong way. Every time there's a problem, everything starts with the individual wanting to make a difference. But real change comes from understanding others and then being understood. I think a famous man called Stephen Covey talked about that in his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Seek first to understand and then be understood. And I don't think we're getting that first part right. So Bob Hawke left a great legacy in Australia. He was human. He was authentic. And he chased what he believed, far from perfect, as none of us are. He was a statesman, however, that changed Australia forever. He had the ear and the touch of everyday Aussies. He placed reform on the agenda. A reform that he first had to get through his party. He had to influence his own party to have that reform. And then he had to influence Australia and the opposition. He was loved for it. We can all learn from Bob. I hope you've been able to stay tuned through this episode of the Dumb Leaders podcast. I hope that you've taken a little bit of insight around maybe a way forward. I'm not saying it is, I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just sharing my views and my thoughts. If there's something in it for you, thanks. Please share it around. I'll be back next week with the next episode. And as I said, I might spend some time dissecting some of those speeches that we saw on election night. Just from the thought concept of what could have been improved. But until then, it's Tony. You've been listening to the Dumb Leaders podcast. I'll see you next week.